Education Secretary Betsy DeVos is threatening to withhold federal funding from schools that refuse to resume in-person classes. A number of districts have already announced they will defy the Trump administration and engage in online-only classes this fall. Among them, Los Angeles and San Diego. And despite cases of COVID-19 surging, DeVos is still demanding schools reopen. Here's how she addressed the issue on Fox News this Sunday.
American investment in education is a promise to students and their families. If schools aren't going to reopen and not fulfill that promise, they shouldn't get the funds. Then give it to the families to decide to go to a school that is going to meet that promise.
Well, you can't do that. I mean, I know you guys support vouchers, and I know you support vouchers, and that's a reasonable argument, but you can't do that unilaterally. You have to do that through Congress.
Well, we're looking at all the options because it's a promise to the American people, to students and their families, and we want to make sure that promise is followed through on.
Alexandra Hudson served as a special assistant to Secretary DeVos and a policy advisor in the Department of Education. She's currently a senior contributor for Young Voices, and she joins me now from Indianapolis. Welcome, Alexandra. So great to have you with us. Thanks for being here. So, based on your experience with the Department of Education, does the Department of Education have the power to force schools to open by withholding funds? Is that within its power?
The Department of Education is an administrative agency, like the Department of Labor, the Department of Energy, that exists to operationalize the laws that Congress, our democratically elected branch of government, passes. And so, no, that she cannot unilaterally withhold funds and make federal dollars conditional on reopening in the fall.
So let me just break it down a little bit, because I think a lot of people may be curious how much federal funding schools get, because most people are under the assumption that the bulk of funding for schools comes from local taxes. So is federal funding a really huge piece of the picture?
It's actually only about 10% of the amount of money that districts operate on. So it's not a huge amount, but it is significant to schools' budget. And as we know, education is essential. It's very important, and every dollar does count.
Of course, definitely for the schools, for sure. But it's interesting because a lot of, conservative commentators have pointed out that DeVos's comments are a break from how she's interpreted the role of the Education Department in the past. She's long championed local and parental control of learning over federal government control. One of her ideological allies told the New York Times, quote, Betsy DeVos 6 months ago would have thought this was ludicrous. So obviously you've worked closely with the secretary. Do you agree that this is a departure from her ideological stance on who should be controlling the schools? And if so, why do you believe she's joining the president in this?
The secretary has long held the belief that parents and students should be at the center of education and education policy decision-making. So it's surprising that she would give decision-making about reopening to bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. instead of delegating this to the local level. No two districts, two states are alike when it comes to the crisis and how they want to respond to it. For example, Los Angeles had 8,000 new reported cases yesterday. I'm calling in from Indianapolis, and the entire state of Indiana had 600 new cases yesterday. Los Angeles is closing. Some schools in Indiana are reopening. That's the decision that should be made at the local district level, and parents should hold them accountable. And so if she were to uphold her values of wanting parents to be in control, she would trust parents to make that decision by holding districts and localities accountable and not condition funds on reopening in the fall physically.
And so why do you think she's straying from that?
Because it's the ideal. Absolutely. It is the ideal that schools reopen in the fall, not just for the sanity of America's parents, but also for the well-being of students. We know that online learning does not have the same social, emotional, and learning gains and benefits that in-person learning has. And so absolutely the ideal is to get students back in the classroom with each other, with teachers as soon as possible. But we cannot have the Secretary of Education creating health policy for the entire nation. And we should not have bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. Deciding this issue for the 13,000 school districts across America that each have different values, different risk tolerance, different priorities. And we need to respect that. And that is very much in line with the Secretary's values.
And do you think Congress then should do that, should intervene in schooling right now? Or do you still believe that it should just come from local districts?
It's very much a part of the conversation around a second stimulus bill and relief bill for the COVID-19 crisis. Thus, education funding would be a part of that. And if I think the Secretary, I would advise her to work with Congress and don't do this unilaterally, to give districts and schools the resources they need and then get out of the way. When I was at the U.S. Department of Education, I led my office's response to Hurricane Harvey and the crisis and devastation that caused to Houston, Texas, to the U.S. Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico. And we took a humble disposition of offering waivers and exemptions, knowing that they had greater things to deal with than reporting and data requirements for my office. And so we took on a very supportive role, a very humble role, saying, let us know how we can support you. Meet your own needs first. And I would advise Congress and the Secretary to take that humble disposition and defer to localities who know their needs best in this circumstance as well.
Right. And, we both mentioned earlier two of the California school districts that have announced they are going to online learning this fall. Some officials, though, of course, want to remain open. Orange County, California's Education Board approved recommendations to keep schools fully open with no masks or social distancing. So on the flip side, does Secretary DeVos have the ability, or at least the responsibility, to intervene in situations that could potentially put people at risk?
It's a good question. And unfortunately, we do know from history that sometimes districts and schools don't make decisions that are in the best interest of students. For example, when I was at the Department of Education, I was in the Office of Special Education and administered the individuals with disabilities and individuals with education, the IDEA. And that law was passed by Congress because schools, unfortunately, turned students with disabilities away because they were too costly and difficult to educate. So Congress passed that law because all students should have equal access to education. So, but that was done by Congress, not by the Secretary of Education. So if there were going to be monitoring provisions to ensure students' well-being, it would be a conversation had with Congress. But at the same time, I don't think that this situation is conducive to that. It's so fluid. We have so little information. The information we do have changes daily. I think that more monitoring from the federal level would only do more harm than good and be counterproductive. And I think, again, localities, parents would be a better form of accountability and good decision-making than bureaucrats in Washington.
All right. Well, Alexandra Hudson, thank you so much for providing that insight into the inner workings of the Department of Education for us. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tanya.
And in a statement provided to CBS News, the Department of Education says, in part, quote, schools must be prepared to deliver a full school year of learning beginning in the fall. This might not look the same in every place. In fact, we hope state and local education leaders take this opportunity to provide families with options based on their personal situations and the local health realities. Students are at the center of everything we do, and Secretary DeVos would not be calling for a return to school if it were unsafe. That statement does not, however, address DeVos's push to withhold funding.